Thank you, Francis. Broad is an understatement, and if anybody was hoping to get some deep sociology today, I'm sorry to disappoint. I'm going to be very interdisciplinary today and perhaps embarking into more natural science than I'm comfortable doing. But I'm going to share with you some ideas that I've sort of been nurturing for a few years now, well, more than a few years, but within the last few years, trying to put some numbers to my ideas. And I want to start with a very bold statement. It's a statement that some people would consider a truism and some people would consider complete blasphemy, but it's a statement that I think is worth giving some attention to, and it's this. Every additional barrel of oil produced will tend to have a higher ecological impact than the previous one. And I think we can probably feel safe in inserting all manner of other non-renewable resources in place of oil, and perhaps some renewable resources as well. We don't talk about this a whole heck of a lot, though, because we don't tend to focus on effort, we tend to focus on reward. But in fact, ecological impact has everything to do with effort. And I'll talk more about what I mean by effort, but in short, it's what we have to go through to turn something that's in the ground or growing on a tree or up in the sky into something that we can actually use. Most of our attention, however, when we talk about our relationship with our ecosystems and how to minimize the impacts that we have on the environment, we tend to talk about consumption. So the ecological footprint is one very common and recently quite well-received means of trying to calculate our impact on the environment. But the ecological footprint is all about consumption. So it's how many cars do we own, how many miles do we drive them, how much fish do we eat, how many trees are getting chopped down. These are all basically measures of how much stuff we're consuming. Which is basically the reward, and it's not the effort. If you look at some of our more common or more well-respected theories, some of these are sociology, so maybe they're less recognizable to some of you than others. We also tend to see a focus on consumption. So ecological modernization, for example, is a very optimistic treatment of our relationship to the natural world, and it basically suggests that by improving our technology and our governance structures, that we can basically reach some sort of synergistic relationship with our ecosystems. IPAT, which was originally introduced by Paul Ehrlich some 40 or so years ago, basically says that impact is a function of population, affluence, and technology. All three of which are basically proxies for consumption. Population, number of consumers, affluence, basically per capita consumption levels, and technology is how efficient our consumption is. Metabolic Rift is something that's a little bit more deeply sociological, that has a lot of cachet in some sociological circles today, but it basically says that impact is a function of capitalism, that because of our capitalist-based economies, they tend to basically support exploitation of nature, and that's the problem. There's nothing here that really speaks to just the basic nuts and bolts of how we're getting stuff out of the ground and turning them into computers or lumber or food for us to eat. But effort does not equal reward. Despite the fact that we have so much emphasis in our popular discussions about this presumed relationship. Reward is only the outcome. It's the end result of our relationship with nature. Ecological disruption instead occurs through the means by which we exploit nature, and not solely what we do with the end result, or how we consume. So, those of you who have had any sort of basic ecology or biology class, I'm sure, are familiar with this graph. This is just one of several graphs that give a simplistic breakdown of metabolism, which basically describes the processes through which something, usually chemicals, are transformed into the other things that are needed by that particular organism. Well, in our case, society is the organism, and we're taking things out of nature and transforming them into stuff that our societal organism need, or we think we need, or we enjoy, to function. So metabolism implies that there's an exchange of materials with the external environment in the form of inputs and wastes, which we all already know, and it implies the need for some kind of symbiotic relationship between the two in order to be sustained. We can't keep taking more good stuff and adding more bad stuff into our environment and expect to carry on indefinitely. Cells know this, but people don't somehow. So if we took that simple metabolism graph and tried to sort of expand upon it and think about our social system and our metabolic relationship with the natural world, it would look something like this. So natural resources go in. Through various metabolic pathways, we process those natural resources into stuff that we use: food, shelter, contributions to economic growth, information exchange systems, and so on and so forth. Now, most of our attention, when we talk about ecological impact, looks here. How much we're consuming and how that translates into ecological impact, either in terms of emissions or perhaps the total volume of natural resources that goes into the total volume of stuff that gets consumed. What we tend not to look at is this relationship across here, and the fact that all kinds of inputs go into those metabolic pathways, and that those inputs are going to change depending on your natural resource, depending on how long that particular natural resource has been exploited, depending on human ingenuity and technological availability, so on and so forth. But those all translate into some fairly significant pathways of ecological impact that we tend not to pay attention to. Although some of us have, and they've used other terms, Howard Odum is considered by some as the father of energy analysis. His initial work, again, goes back to the 1970s. He's got lots of followers these days, particularly who work in fields called energy return on investment. He used a different word for what I'm describing as effort. He called it emergy, which basically means the total amount of energy, resources, and all of the other stuff that goes into producing a given unit of material output. But because not all material and energy resources are of the same quality, they're going to require different amounts of all of these inputs in order to transform them into something usable. Wood doesn't involve a tremendous metabolic process in order to turn it into lumber to build houses with. Using something like oil sands to put into our gas tank involves a longer metabolic pathway, different kinds of energy and material and labor inputs that go into that transformation process. And in general, even if we're looking at a single resource base, timber or oil or coal, a lower quality resource is going to require a longer metabolic pathway. And that means it's going to take more stuff, more energy to produce it. Now, this is all not coming from me. This is coming from Howard Odum and his contemporaries in the past 30 or 40 years. And so basically what he's arguing is the net return to society that we get from extracting and processing natural resources, called the energy yield ratio, is a direct function of these energy inputs. And that's ultimately how we ought to be thinking about what good we're receiving from the choices that we make in terms of the natural resources that we exploit and how much and how. Okay, the challenge is that very simplistic idea of energy or effort is not so simplistic to actually measure. So it's really a function of two things. One is basically a description of nature, and the other one is a description of society. The first one, resource quality, basically describes the richness or the density of the resource in its natural form, how easy it is for us to get to that resource. And then on the other side, you've got a whole host of variables that describe how we as human beings go through the process of extracting and converting those resources and getting them to market and all the rest. And that is a morass of not just technological and demographic issues, but it has to do with culture and politics and education and economics. So there's a whole bunch of stuff that goes into that labor piece, which makes it much more difficult to try to measure in some way. But the dimensions of resource quality, which I want to focus on here, mainly because it is the easier piece, include things, for example, like how deep the resource is, the proportion of impurities in the mineral pool, the number of transformative steps required to turn it into something that we actually use in our economies, the distance from places of consumption, so how far are we shipping the stuff through a pipeline or on a ship. All of these can more or less be considered dimensions of what we're calling quality in very general terms. The point is, the main point that I think is important to take home is that over time, if we're looking at a single resource and a single reserve of that resource, that we're going to see that resource decline in quality over time. Now, most people who are involved in extracting these resources already know this. This isn't anything new. But it translates into an increase in effort. So what you see in front of you is basically the history of offshore oil development, in which case we started with the fairly shallow and easily accessible pools, which didn't take particularly technologically advanced wells to get access to them. But as those began to be fewer and farther between, then we had to start to look at technological developments that would allow us to get to those deeper pools, and so on and so on and so on, until today we're looking at offshore, accessing offshore oil reserves in which we need to drill down with amazing precision with a drill 10,000 feet below the ocean surface, which is an incredible technological feat. But of course, there's all kinds of ecological risks associated with that. But on top of that, just the additional resources that it takes to develop and then construct and then maintain this well is going to be a whole heck of a lot more than it took to do the same for that well. Okay, so brings us to a proposition of sorts, I guess, that I'm calling the effort factor, simply because effort, I think, is more palatable than emergy, much as I like Odom's work. And it basically says this: the relationship between resource quality and metabolic effort is inverse. So as resource quality goes down, effort goes up. Metabolic effort is directly related to ecological impact. And resource quality inevitably declines over the course of extractive history for a particular resource. And therefore, the marginal ecological cost of natural resource exploitation is going to tend to increase over time. So, bearing in mind the challenges that I've already said in terms of trying to turn this into an empirical analysis, I just want to throw out a couple of brief examples that tend to show or suggest support for the idea, and then I want to look at a little more detail at oil. But first of all, we can look at things like coal extraction. And if you look at a single history of a single region, that's sort of the cleanest way to try to look at changes in trends. And a lot of this data, at the regional level at least, is publicly available. The difficulty is trying to find an indicator that serves as a reasonable proxy for ecological impact. So that changes depending on what you're looking at. But in the case of coal, for example, we have data available that shows the proportion that is extracted through underground mining and that is extracted through surface mining. And in general, while there's definitely ecological impacts in both cases, relatively speaking, my understanding is that surface mining involves a more significant impact. And what we have seen over time, not just in the UK, but the UK provides the cleanest and longest history, is that over time, as The pool itself, the reserve, the amount of coal available in the UK declines. The proportion that gets extracted by surface mining as opposed to by underground mining goes up. So the harder it is to find this stuff, the more likely we're going to use an extraction technology that's far more efficient at getting everything out of the ground than it would be the case for an underground mining technique. Just a couple of other examples. Fertilizer use in China's grain production shows also a similarly clean relationship. In this case, production isn't going down, they're continuing to increase because this is basically a period of industrialization of China's agriculture, so they had lots of room to improve. But proportionally, what's interesting is that black line, and that basically suggests that fertilizer use per ton of crop, so per volume of grain produced, is going up exponentially, in fact continuously over that period of time. Now if all things were as they ought to be, we ought to see some sort of threshold level where the amount of fertilizer that we need to produce a certain volume of grain should be constant or preferably declining. But in this case, it's continuing to increase over the course of the last 50 years of grain production in China. One final example, and this is pulled from colleague Daniel Pauly at the University of British Columbia, who's been tracking all sorts of information on global fish catch. And what he shows in his data, again, similar to coal in the UK, although not quite as dramatic, our global fisheries catches are on the decline. But what he shows is over that history, the effort that is going into catching that fish on a per volume basis is continuing to go up. So we're spending more and more resources. What he uses is a gigawatt, so he looks at everything from the size of the boats and how long they're on the water and their fuel requirements and so on and so forth, and compares that to the amount of haul they're bringing back to shore. And he shows that we're expending more and more and more energy to get the same volume of harvest when our global fisheries are on the decline. So we have to work harder to get the stuff back home. Now, if we look a little bit more closely at oil, oil's a nice case because there's lots of really compelling information that suggests that globally our oil supplies are indeed on the decline. And so whereas in lots of cases, if we tried to look at a global resource and tried to look for evidence of this effort factor relationship, a lot of that's going to get masked because as we exploit coal in the UK, for example, we just over the course of, well, in the case of the UK, several hundred years, we see new coal deposits being extracted, or not new deposits, but new efforts to exploit other coal deposits elsewhere. So you see a tremendous amount of regional variation that tends to mask any kind of a global trend. But in the case for oil, we might be at a point now globally where we can perhaps see some global trends. So oil is basically the largest share of our global energy resources. It has been for the last 40 years or so. We currently consume somewhere between 84 and 85 million barrels per day at the global level again. And 62% of that supports our transportation sector. So that's where all of our oil is going. What has been happening lately, though, is that our production levels, which are more or less in line with our consumption levels, have been increasing while our discovery levels are decreasing. In fact, by 2011, our discoveries were less than half of the consumption for that year. And for petrochemical geologists, particularly Colin Campbell, who put this particular graph together, that's a bit alarming, and that seems to suggest that there aren't going to be any great new big discoveries in the near future that are going to help to support our high levels of demand. Okay, so we're running out of oil, but how do we begin to look at how perhaps our effort at getting that oil out of the ground is increasing, and how does that translate into an ecological impact? Well, here it's tough. You can look at a number of different kinds of proxies. But one interesting trend, I think, is the technologies that we use for basically land-based conventional oil drilling. Now, historically, well drilling entailed basically what's called primary recovery, which means we don't use any kinds of pressure-inducing strategies to get the stuff from below the surface up to the surface. Today, primary recovery, and this data is extracted from the United States because there's a couple of really good papers that have collected this data for us. Primary recovery in the United States only counts for 0.2% of total U.S. production. Instead, the vast majority is either secondary recovery or tertiary recovery. Secondary recovery is water flooding. We do a lot of this in Alberta too. It accounts for more like 80% of oil extraction. Again, we're just talking about conventional oil here in the United States. And then tertiary recovery, which refers to using not just water, but rather steam or chemicals to basically force the oil back to the surface, accounts for about 20%. Now, whereas primary recovery basically involves a minimal amount of water, secondary recovery requires 62 gallons of water per million BTU, per 1,000 BTU, and then tertiary recoveries require about 2/3 of that because, of course, they're using steam and chemicals rather than water to do their work for them. Yeah. How many BTUs? I thought about converting that, and I should have, and I'm sorry, and I don't remember how many BTUs go into a barrel, but I can, if you catch me afterwards, I can definitely send that to you. And they're starting to get real concerned about this in the United States. In fact, one congressional report warned that the amount of fresh water consumed by the energy sector is projected to rise 50% between 2005 and 2030. And this is already a relatively water-scarce country when you look at all of the other demands that are placed on water, at least in a number of regions within the United States. So there's one indicator. It's the increased water use that we need basically to maintain our production levels of oil. The other one is well productivity. So how long is one given well going to continue to produce oil, and at what rate? Declining well productivity means that if we want to maintain production levels, we need to basically put more wells out there on the land base. In the United States, again, average oil well productivity has fallen at 17.2% just in the past 2 decades. Till now, it's an average of 10 billion barrels per day per well on the land. However, that doesn't reflect the variation in well productivity. There are a couple of really strongly producing wells still, but overall, as of way back in 1997, 76% of all of the active wells in the U.S. produced only 2.2 barrels of oil per day. Basically, 76% of the wells contributed 15% of total U.S. production. Okay, so let's come to Alberta now. Where we see very similar trends. So what you have in front of you here, again, is looking at conventional oil production in Alberta. And the black line shows basically the total volume of production in million cubic meters over time. So we peaked back in the early 70s, about the same time the United States peaked with their conventional oil production. And we've been facing a rocky but fairly consistent downward trajectory since then. But the gray line basically shows the annual number of wells drilled per annual volume of production. So we're putting more and more and more wellheads out on the land base to try to extract the last bit of oil that we can get our hands on, at least up until about 2008, when we basically stopped putting nearly as many wells out there on the land base. Nonetheless, we still have quite a lot going on in Alberta. Combined, over 300,000 oil and gas wells have been drilled throughout our history. There's about between 10 and 15 new wells drilled each year. Again, this is both oil and gas combined. This is not just oil. But in terms of conventional oil wells, we still have about 41,000 currently in operation. It takes about 120 hectares each day that get disturbed for oil and gas production combined. But we're basically going to be continuing to face the same trajectory that I just showed for the United States. 70% of our remaining reserves are basically in a very small proportion of our pools, basically the largest 3% of our pools. And while we've been putting a lot of effort into coming up with new technologies to get at more of the stuff that's in these pools, basically what those efforts have amounted to, in one example, for the Swan Hills, for example, we have managed to increase the recoverable reserve size of the Swan Hills Reserve by a mere 1.7% with all of our efforts at things like water flooding and horizontal drilling. Average daily well production rate was 145 barrels per day back in 1973. It's down to about 12 now, and 45% of our wells produce less than 6 barrels per day. In fact, a third of them produce about 3 barrels per day. And we're increasingly turning towards, again, new extraction technologies to get what's left. More than half of the wells drilled as of 2007 were horizontal wells. Now, we're still talking about conventional oil here, which we also get by horizontal wells. It's not the same thing as oil shale, although the process is similar at getting at it. But these are still, we're talking about extracting liquid oil from below the surface rather than trying to extract it from shale. The problem is that horizontal well drilling has a much faster depletion rate than conventional wells. So production from a standard vertical well declines about 20% in the first year. It's a pretty big drop, but not so big as for horizontal wells, which decline 40% in the first year. Okay, so a lot of you might be saying, yeah, okay, so we're running out of conventional oil. We know this. But look at our oil reserves. They're like 70% unconventional oil. So what's the problem? Why are we worried? Unconventional sources at the moment only provide about 4 million barrels per day globally, which is, 5%? Natural gas liquids provide quite a bit more. And extraction is going up pretty steeply because there's lots of new attention, and the economics are supporting investment in lots of these unconventional oil plays. Okay, shale is the one that's getting a whole heck of a lot of attention lately, and as you can see by this map, shale is everywhere, and we have quite a bit of it here in Canada, but it's all over the United States, Russia, China. California is looking at developing their shale. The UK, everybody's trying to figure out how they can get at their shale to increase their own energy security. So, extracting shale is basically done by what's called hydraulic fracturing, or what we've all more commonly heard in the media, fracking. And I'm not going to give you a whole lot of details about the process, but basically it means drilling down vertically for usually a mile or so, because that's basically the depth of most shale deposits, although there's lots of variation there, and then sending one or more likely several lateral extensions out from that vertical drilling point, and some of those extensions can be as long as 10,000 feet. I think that's an extraordinary technological achievement, but it's also one that comes at huge input costs. There's a lot of energy that goes into trying to do this. And the question is, what do we get out of that? Well, the jury's still out on environmental impacts. They're certainly getting lots of media attention lately. Things that have come up have been just the scale of land destruction that's associated with shale extraction, the high water and energy requirements that is involved in getting this stuff out of the ground, particularly when you compare it to the amount of oil that we receive. the high greenhouse gas intensity compared to conventional oil extraction. Earthquakes aren't actually the result of the extraction process itself. It's actually because of or allegedly because of the way that we store water afterwards, because we basically shoot the used water back down into the substrate, and that has a destabilizing effect. But the big one that's been getting a lot of attention, particularly in the United States, are the water quality impacts of these efforts. In fact, one of the real big concerns of all of the flooding in Colorado right now is basically the what used to be contained used water supplies are now basically run amok in the flood waters. Okay. I'm not going to provide a professional assessment of environmental impacts of fracking. It's certainly not my area. I think there's certainly enough there to raise some eyebrows and warrant more attention. But what I think is interesting is the thing that doesn't really get talked about very much in the media, and that is how much are we getting out of this? So I think we can all agree that the energy that it takes to extract and process non-conventional oil is going to be more than conventional oil. But are we getting more more out of it to make it worthwhile? Well, according to Rafael Sandreas, who's an oil consultant, and he's, by the way, very enthusiastic about non-conventional oils. He's not a critic by any means. He's done probably the most research on oil shale so far in North America. And if you look at the Bakken field, which, by the way, covers quite a bit of Canada, although most of the attention has been in places like North Dakota and Montana. The Bakken field has an estimated 5 billion recoverable barrels, produces about 375,000 barrels per day. Each well has a recovery factor of 1.2%. And after the first year, that well, the productivity of that well is going to decline between 65 and 90%. So basically, you have to replace that well the next year if you want to maintain your production level. Production in the Elm Coulee field, which is further south from the Bakken, I believe, and has been in production for longer, they have a recovery factor of 5.6%. So relatively attractive compared to the Elm Coulee field. We just started extracting or exploiting the Elm Coulee field in 2000. Well, it peaked in 6 years. And its peak was only 53,000 barrels per day. And today it produces basically less than half of that, which is a fraction of U.S. consumption rates. Okay, so what about here? What about our oil sands, which is another form of unconventional fuel? Well, oil sands actually has a pretty high recovery factor. Like every other form of mining, we're actually taking everything that is available within a particular area, right? So if we're basically mining, we are removing all of the potential oil within a particular area. That translates into a high recovery factor. But if you look at our in situ wells, which most of our oil sands deposits can only be extracted by drilling because they're not close enough to the surface to access by mining, 85% of the reserves that require in situ extraction only have a recovery rate of 10%, not the 82% that mining enjoys. There have been a couple of studies that have tried to assess the relative ecological impact of oil sands mining, and I think some of them are not just mining, but in situ as well. They provide some telling information. Dyer and Huot, for example, estimated that oil sands mining directly disturbs about 9.5 hectares of land per million barrels of oil produced. In situ has a much, much smaller direct impact on the land base, about 1.4 hectares per barrel produced. But when you consider the effect of fragmentation, in both cases, land disturbed by in situ wells is roughly double that for mining. And then there's an additional catch, and that is how much land gets disturbed by the provision of the energy inputs. So that piece of energy that goes into both the mining and the in situ processes. Well, currently, in situ drilling requires roughly about 4 times the energy input on average as mining. And the land disrupted by the exploitation of that natural gas that goes into the in situ process is about 3 times as large as the land that's consumed by the wells themselves. And this comes from a handful of our own Alberta researchers, Jordan, Keith, and Stelfox. Okay, so compelling, but the question is now what? We have a pretty firm relationship between economic well-being and energy consumption. What this graph shows is the relationship between gross national product on a national basis with commercial energy consumption in each of those countries. And it's not a perfect relationship, but it is a pretty solid upward trend. The more energy you have access to, the stronger your economy is going to be. Okay, so then the question becomes, we need this stuff, but it looks like the harder we try to get this stuff out of the ground, the more impact that it's going to have. And so how do we respond? So coming back to that original idea that our impact is going to be a function of effort. And that effort is a combination of both the quality of the resource and our labor and technology practices. If resource quality decline is inevitable, so if that Q is inevitably going to go down over time, then that means if we want to keep our impact at least constant and not have it increase, then that means that the ecological efficiency of our labor and technology practices have to increase indefinitely. Now, no matter how optimistic you are about our human ingenuity, that sounds like an impossibility theorem to me. So we face a future trajectory in which the marginal impact is going to continue to increase. It might be a bumpy road. There might be lots of geographic variations in that road. But nonetheless, overall, it seems pretty clear that we're going to face this trajectory over time. So the question is, how do we respond? And so now in the last 5 minutes, you get a little bit of sociology. So here are some plausible responses, some of which are already happening. So we know that in a capitalist economy, production is going to continue as long as surplus value is generated. So as long as the dollars out are larger than the dollars in, we're going to continue to see production. But as energy increases, those input dollars also increase, right? It costs money to invest in research. It costs money to get land and energy and water, although some of those things are pretty heavily subsidized in some places. It costs money to build a very high-tech, mile-long oil well to put under the ocean. We might do some research into substitution, although so far we haven't found an equivalent substitute for any of our fossil fuels, much less for oil. We might end up just continuing to invest in costlier and riskier extraction technologies, which we're already doing. We might just start to see slowly higher prices or higher levels of government subsidization of extraction of our natural resources. We could see a reduction in basically government's requirements for environmental amelioration. Fracking, for example, is exempt from the Clean Water Act in the United States. Or maybe we'll see some reduced consumption in some of these areas. But the question is, what kinds of conditions would support each of these different kinds of responses? And that's a question that we just don't know. So trying to empiricize what I have been arguing conceptually, I think is a big challenge, although I think it's an important one to try to look at. The data that I've been showing you, these 4 graphs basically show us historical patterns, which are interesting. And the fact that we see very similar patterns in different regions and different sectors, I think that's pretty compelling. But nonetheless, they're still just patterns, right? There's nothing here that tells us about any sort of causal relationships and what are a very complex system. And in each of these cases, in China, for example, you've got huge investments by the government in basically industrializing, and that means bringing fertilizer into agriculture in China. So that's going to basically create some noise in this data, which basically prevent us from drawing any sort of simplistic conclusions about what's going on here. So we need some kind of model or framework that basically captures the kinds of socio-ecological metabolism that we've been talking about. We don't really have that yet because we don't talk together often enough. Howard Odum, this is one example of his MRG system model here on the left side. He's made a real concerted effort to basically capture social dimensions of his energy systems. But nonetheless, there's not a whole lot here that really describes how people are different and how people respond, basically what sociologists would call agency. And then if we turn to sociology, we've got some really nice models these days of how social change happens, about how social agents contribute to organizational change, which contribute to institutional change, and so on and so forth. But there's no ecology in any of those models, at least none that I've come across. So we've got this huge gap. So I wish I could tell you that I have managed to fill this gap today, but I'm not. But I think that this is where we need to start. And again, this is very simplistic. But if we go back to that original model of our socio-metabolic system, we've got natural resources that come in. They undergo certain metabolic pathways. We get stuff for society. And throughout all of that process, we're having basically an impact on our ecosystems. Within that, how those pathways actually transpire have everything to do with individual decision-making and investments, where we're putting money in education and research, social agents making consumption decisions, how big your house is, and then we've also got lots of people responding to ecological degradation or not, or ignoring it. So the question is, how can we take this and not only try to capture it at one particular time, but make some plausible arguments about what things might look like in the future. So what might the emergent outcomes be at time 2? And so I'm hoping that you all are willing to put some work into this. And I'm going to stop there.